That's right. He'll come in. While we're waiting, we know how to prepare for any teaching. There's the getting ourselves in a proper physical posture, you know, comfortable, but comfortably upright. And then bring our attention inward. And then the most important aspect is to try to generate as altruistic and as expansive a motivation as we can for being here. So that we're not, so that from my side, I'm not just reading an academic list of different points, and from your side, you're not just thinking to gain just parcels of knowledge or information, but most especially since it is the Dharma, and the purpose of the Dharma is to allow us to overcome suffering and dissatisfaction and achieve our highest potential, that we hope that from what happens here in these 2 hours, the speaking, the listening, the thinking, the questioning, all of this we can use to get a better understanding of the nature of our mind, to observe which aspects of the mind need correction, and to generate the good qualities that we all do have, and with the intention of fulfilling it in such a way that this 2 hours together will prove not only beneficial for ourselves, but for the people that we meet. Okay, so we'll just sit quietly for a moment, and then I'll begin. So perhaps we shouldn't wait any longer. Um, so maybe a good place for me to start is by giving a brief background as to where this particular teaching came from. In general, it was not Lama Yeshe's habit to teach whole texts or even whole sections of texts. Usually he just talked to whatever people needed in front of him. It was like an ongoing conversation that he had. And even when there was a text, often he just used that as a springboard for addressing what was ever on the minds of the people who were present. That was one of his special qualities. So it was very surprising to me on one occasion, many years ago, when Lama Yeshe decided he was going to teach this short section, very short section, from Tsongkhapa's Lamrim Chenmo, the Great Treatise on the stages of the path to enlightenment. And I remember as I was listening to those teachings, I said, my goodness, he's doing it. He's actually covering all the material in this section of the text, because in that time it was kind of an unusual event, right? Of course, it was still Lama Yeshe, so he mixed it in with a lot of humor, a lot of dramas, a lot of examples from people's lives, but he did actually cover the points. And I think he was able to do it because if you look into the Lamrim Chenmo, and on the piece of paper that you either have or will have once you leave here, it's listed where all of this material is found. You'll see it's very short. And the title, depending on which text you use, is How Delusions Arise, the 6 fundamental factors causing delusions to arise. And so in the different texts, different versions of these teachings, these 6 are sometimes simply listed, the same way I've listed on the board in front, just kind of bullet points, or expanded due to, on the basis of further commentary. So these teachings were given by Lama Yeshe and then edited into an article, and Wisdom Energy, which was one of their very early publications by Wisdom Publications of the teachings of Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa Rinpoche, had already come out, and they were going to print a further edition of it. And at that time, I realized that Lama Yeshe's teachings on these 6 factors causing delusions to arise would fit in perfectly with the earlier edition of Wisdom Energy. So if you have one of the old copies, I think it had an orange cover. If you have one of these old copies, this chapter may not appear in it. But if you have a newer one, like the one I'm holding up, then it appears as chapter 4 in that text. So, the 6 factors causing delusions to arise. Now I'm going to give you a little kind of a quiz. Since this is going to be talking about delusions and what causes them to arise, if you were to figure out where this teaching would fit in the traditional Buddhist presentation, where very often the scheme that's followed are the Four Noble Truths, right? Under which of the Four Noble Truths would you imagine this topic to appear? Don't everybody raise your hand at once. Yeah, Min.
I'm guessing it's the cause of suffering.
The cause of suffering. Exactly. That's exactly the answer. So maybe we should back up a little bit. What are the Four Noble Truths? Just their names. The first one?
Life's happiness.
Suffering.
Yeah, the truth of suffering. Did someone say life is suffering? I heard something, and I don't know whether I heard it correctly.
Life's happiness.
No.
Life is happiness? That's a different religion. Right?
I think you read my mind. You were doing your thing where you read my mind. I was thinking life is suffering.
Sometimes the First Noble Truth is abbreviated life is suffering. I think that's a really big mistake.
Good.
Why? Why is that a mistake? I mean, it appears in print sometimes.
It makes it sound permanent. Because life's not always suffering.
First of all, it's not only suffering, right?
That's right.
Uh-huh.
That's right, because Lama said, life is also joy.
Yeah, yeah. So, if you have a phrase like life is suffering, or better yet, there is suffering. Just that. Mm-hmm. There is suffering. Suffering exists. People suffer, okay? If you want to connect it with life, right, then you'd have to say something like, life lived under the influence of destructive behavior, karma, and the afflictive emotions, right? Life lived under those influences is suffering. That would be right. But that's not the only way to live one's life. And that's the whole reason why Buddha was teaching, was to show that we have a choice. We can either follow the pattern we've been doing so far and just create more and more destructive karma and give sway to the afflictions, or the obscurations, and then inevitably we will experience one or another form of suffering. Sometimes it will be a very obvious form, right? But even in ordinary cases when things are going well, there's often an underlying sense of restlessness, a feeling, is this all there is? Shouldn't there be something more that's happening? Some kind of confusion, some kind of veil over reality. So a person may look very happy, and yes, he or she is happy to a certain extent, but it is still under the influence of factors which sooner or later will bring about more obvious experiences of dis-ease, dissatisfaction, and suffering. Okay, so that's the first noble truth is a description of the ways in which life has this life lived under these influences is unsatisfactory. Okay, and then so a one-word description of the Four Noble Truths. The first one is just suffering. And a one-word description or short phrase description of the second Noble Truth, what would that be? Cause of suffering. Cause of suffering, right? Suffering, cause of suffering, right? And then the third one, I kind of feel like in old New Englander school marm, and I want to take out my ruler and start hitting your knuckles, because anyone who has practiced or studied Buddhism for 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 50 years, as people here have been doing, one of those numbers, should be able to rattle off the Four Noble Truths. At least the 4 words that are often just used to just summarize them. Because this is the heart and the soul. This is the basis of all the Buddhist teaching. So if someone comes, like if we were in a if we were in a Catholic environment, for example, And all of us had been practicing Catholics for that many years. And the question came up, what are the three persons of the divinity? The answer being the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, right? If we couldn't answer that question, then what were we doing all those Sundays? You know, what were we listening to? Since that's right at the heart of the Catholic Dharma, right? Well, right at the heart of the Buddhist Dharma is the Four Noble Truths, which Buddha presented in his very first sermon, his very first discourse, just weeks after his attainment of enlightenment, right? And in it, he outlined these Four Noble Truths, the first one being the existence of suffering, the second that this suffering is not random, but it actually has a cause, and then he identified the cause. And then the third noble truth was, even though there is suffering and it has a cause, if the cause can be overcome, right, suffering ceases. So the third noble truth is cessation. Or you can say end or stopping, but usually it's translated cessation. The cessation of suffering. But in order to achieve that cessation of suffering, there's something you have to do. You can't just wait it out, right? Because while you're waiting it out, you're giving rise to more emotional obscurations and creating more negative karma, and you're creating the cause for even more suffering. So it's not something that comes to an end after, like a prison sentence. You're in there for 10 years and you finish the 10 and then you're free. It's not like that, right? You have to do something. You have to put the teachings that show us how to eliminate or overcome the causes of suffering, you have to put them into practice. And so that's the fourth noble truth, the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. So the next time some New England schoolmarm comes in and threatens you with a ruler and asks, what are the Four Noble Truths? You say, at the very least, say suffering, cause, cessation, and path. Okay? And then we can retire. All right. So then the question I asked in the beginning, which was answered perfectly correctly, was if we were going to discuss this topic, how delusions arise, right? Where among the Four Noble Truths would we expect to find this discussed? And it would be under the second one, right? Because delusions or afflictions, sometimes they're called, these together with the karma or the destructive actions that they give rise to, these are the cause of suffering. Right? Very often the way this is phrased is suffering arises from karma and delusions. And in this way, nearly every time I hear it mentioned, karma is mentioned first. You know, the cause of suffering is karma. But the cause of karma itself is delusion. So when you say karma and delusion, karma is giving a kind of an overall step back picture of it, and the delusion is now homing in on that which creates the karma, that which creates the causes of suffering in the first place. Okay, so in Lamrim, with Stages of the Path teaching, they discuss at length the first noble truth of suffering, and then the second noble truth. There's a in-depth discussion of what the various mental, emotional factors are that create the cause of suffering, and so there's lists of the 20 obscurations or the 20 delusions, a list of the 6 major delusions, and sometimes it's abbreviated down to the 3 root delusions. Right? You've heard those expressions, the 3 root delusions. I haven't looked around the room yet, but there's a wheel of life here, isn't
It's
it?
in the very back on the other of this side.
Oh, okay.
Very backwards.
Well, I'm sure you've all memorized the wheel of life picture.
Yeah.
what's at the very hub of the wheel of life?
You mean the image or?
The image.
The rooster, the
Is
pig.
it the rooster? No, no.
Yeah. Right. At the very, very hub of the illustration of the wheel of life, there are three animals. There's a pig, and most accurately, out of the mouth of the pig is coming a rooster or a fowl of some sort of pigeon. Sometimes roosters. It's often identified as a rooster, and a snake. So you have a pig, a rooster, and a snake. And in some images, these three form a loop, right? They're all connected. But I've heard it explained by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, among others, that it's more accurate to have the snake and the rooster, the fowl, coming out of the mouth of the pig. Why is that?
Yeah, it's hard to find that picture too.
Well, it does exist, but why is that? Why is that the case, that it should be that way?
Ignorance is
Ignorance is that's the attachment and hatred or anger comes from ignorance.
Perfect, right. So these three, the snake is anger or hatred, let's say. I avoid just simply saying anger, because people always say, well, isn't some form of anger good? You know, if you see an injustice, shouldn't that make you angry, right? Shouldn't you be angry with it? And that's true. You shouldn't be passive in the face of that. But here, this anger isn't just seeing something that you think should be overcome or that's wrong. It's not just that. It's hatred. It's being on fire. It's attacking. It's giving harm. It's wishing to give harm. So that's what the snake is. And they use the snake because the snake hisses and then strikes like that. So it's not a bad image for hatred. And the other animal coming out of the mouth of the pig is the other twin delusion, and that is sometimes called attachment, desirous attachment, grasping attachment, like that, or simply a greed, you know. But both of those, as Angela pointed out, both of those come from a deeper delusion, which is ignorance or misknowing the nature of reality. And the pig represents, oh, by the way, I think the fowl, the rooster is used because they're often an example of great longing desire.
Yeah, well, why is that?
Because I think that's what happens in the hen houses.
Yeah, they got one rooster and a whole mess of hens.
Yeah. I think it's based on that, right? And then they come out of the mouth of the pig. Now, of course, the pig, compared to many, many other animals, is really quite intelligent, right? But is used as an example of ignorance because the pig, at least to human eyes, spends a lot of its time wallowing in the mud, right? And so that's the image. It's not a slander on pigs. It's just that it's a very potent symbol. Right? So we have the three root delusions, hatred, attachment, and ignorance. I'll call them that. If you wanted to reduce that to just one, then you just go straight to the ignorance. Because once you have ignorance, a misknowing of the nature of reality, then the other delusions arise as a matter of course. Okay? And then there is an explanation of the 6 root delusions. So added to the original ones, you have other ones such as jealousy and things like that. And then there's a list of the 20 delusions in which the commentary goes into more detail. But it's basically enough just to know the 3 root delusions, to have some sense of them. Okay? So placing those animals in the very heart of the wheel of life is an indication that everything that arises in that wheel, and the wheel is the wheel of ignorantly conditioned existence. In other words, it is the life that is suffering. All of those realms of suffering are indicated in that wheel, and at the hub, what keeps it together are those three root delusions. Now, to indicate that life itself is not necessarily suffering, it's the way you live your life that makes it suffering or not. Then in the picture of the wheel of life, up in the right-hand corner, you have the Buddha, and he's pointing to what's in the upper left-hand corner, and that's the moon, indicating, okay, this is the wheel of suffering existence, but there's another existence. That's the moon. That's liberation. So indicating there's another way of living the life outside this wheel. Okay. So that indicates the central place that delusions or afflictions, to give it another name, have in these teachings of Buddhism in general, and specifically the Second Noble Truth. So in Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary in the Lama Chenmo, when he's already talked about identifying the various delusions and so forth, comes a very, very short paragraph in which he states something to the effect of these delusions arise in our mind based on a number of factors, and the 6 primary factors on which are the occasion for the delusions to arise are these 6 that he then outlines very, very briefly. Just a word in general in terms of how we would define an obscuration or delusion. Not so much giving lists of it, the 3 or the 6 or the 20, but what is in common among everything that's called an obscuration or a delusion. And there is, I remember the first time I heard this definition, it must have been from Geshe Ngawang Dargye many, many years ago. But since then I've heard it from many, many teachers. It's a commonly understood phrase. Something is a delusion which, when it arises, it destroys whatever peace of mind we've had up to that point. In other words, you identify a delusion by its function, what it actually does, and it disturbs the mind. Now, some of the delusions are so obviously mental disturbances we don't even have to investigate that. If one were to catch sight of oneself, or like see one's face in the mirror when we've just gotten really, really angry, when hatred is starting to arise, you can even tell just by the way our face looks that we're disturbed, right? It's something very easy to see in other people. We can often tell, even if another person's not speaking, whether they're filled with hatred or not. We can see the disturbance in their whole bodily posture, their whole face. Just their aura is one of disturbance. So some things like that are easy to identify. Another one, which is, I think, extremely easy to identify, is jealousy. If we've ever been bitten by the green-eyed monster of jealousy, we know there's nothing comfortable about it, right? We're angry at him, we're angry at her, we're angry at ourselves. It's just a completely disturbing state of mind. But there's other things that are listed among the delusions which on face value don't always seem like a disturbance. In fact, they often seem like it's what makes life worth living, right? What would that be? Yeah, pride is one of them. though pride is difficult because that you can divide into two parts, and one pride is not a delusion at all. You know, it's just like a healthy sense of I have a disability or not. But on top of that, it's the pride that holds on to me. Look at me, you know. Well, when we do that, it in one sense as well, it supports a sense of who we are and everything that seems like really necessary to live our life. But if we check carefully, we see that it's a disturbance to try to maintain and promote and defend such a sense of self like that. But attachment itself, you know, like when we go to where people are shopping, let's say. So coming up to Christmas, we'll see that almost everywhere we turn. A whole group of people, you know, seeing attractive items in the store windows. And at least in the beginning, they're not frowning, they're smiling, right? Their eyes are kind of bright, like, oh, look at that wonderful thing, you know, right? So it actually seems like, well, that's pretty good. That's not a delusion. That's the spice of life, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Do you have that feeling? But it is still classified as a delusion, as a cause for suffering. Why is that? Is the Buddha wrong? Is that actually happiness?
Because you think, I have to have it.
Right. It's automatically connected with a dissatisfied state of mind, right? Right? It's there in the store window. Oh, how wonderful. You know, if I bought that for my friend or if I bought it for myself, you know, how wonderful like that. And so then you have to do something about it, right? And in the process of doing something about it, purchasing it, it brings up many, many difficulties. And one of the largest difficulties is that item that roused this attachment in the first place isn't going to keep sparking that reaction. That sense of excitement, that spice, is going to pass. Often very quickly, often soon after you purchase it, right? So now you're in possession of this lump of material, which is no longer giving you any pleasure. In fact, it's giving you a lot of dissatisfaction because, oh, I should have waited. Next week there'll be a sale on it. And my neighbor got a better one, you know.
Maybe she just should return it.
Return it, right? And that's where the faces on the people who are doing the shopping, when the returning comes, that's where you don't see that many smiles at all on anybody's face. Okay? So, this isn't intended to be like a bummer, you know, that there's no happiness or no joy in life. But when we're under the influence of this insatiable attachment, that's a disturbance. There is no peace of mind when we're in that particular state. All right. So now we can get to down to the actual subject matter, because Tsongkhapa pointed out in his Lamrim that these delusions, these mental disturbances, they arise, and of course, as they arise, they disturb the mind. That's their function. They arise due to a number of different factors, and he specifies 6. I'm of the impression from the commentaries that I read that this is not an exhaustive list. You know, I might be wrong, but I don't think it's meant to be exhaustive. I think, like with many lists, 6 are mentioned. There may be other ones as well, though I think the other ones probably are going to turn out to be subcategories of one of these 6, right? But anyway, it's identified, at least it helps for memorization. It's easier to remember these 6. And they're listed in the different texts, and in the handout that you have. You don't have to watch it now because it's on the poster in front. But in the handout, there are different ways these 6 are presented, the different ways they're translated. So on the board, I've just mentioned the briefest way that we can mention these 6, just as suffering, cause, cessation, and path is the simplest way of mentioning the Four Noble Truths, then this is the kind of the simplest way of mentioning the 6 factors that cause delusions to arise. So just to read them off, the first one is basis. And by the way, in all of the translations that I've consulted, and there's 4 listed here, or the commentaries I've consulted, all of them use basis. And the second one is object, and also that is pretty much common through all of them. The third one is distraction, and this, as we'll see, this is when it's expanded so that we find out what distraction actually means. Then there's different ways of explaining it, so we'll look at those. So we have basis, object, distraction, and then explanation. And the word explanation needs a lot of explanation, right? Because Dharma is explanation, right? So what do you imagine is missing from the word explanation to make sense out of it?
Wrong explanation.
Wrong or misleading explanation, okay? But it's coming from an explanation that we've heard or that we've been exposed to, right? And then the next one, the fifth one, is habit, and that's also pretty much the way it's presented in all the commentaries. And the last one, briefly, attention, and this needs expansion, but I'm going to put it off until we get to it. Okay. Because obviously it is good to be able to pay attention. You know, the whole mindfulness thing is based on being able to pay attention. So attention itself is not a problem, but a certain kind of attention is a factor, a major factor for causing delusions to arise. Okay? So these teachings, you know, under the category of the cause of suffering, as I mentioned, is very often abbreviated that the cause of suffering is karma and delusion. That due to the arisal of a delusion in our mind, such as hatred, jealousy, and so forth, we engage in certain actions. And that's where karma comes in. Karma just means actions of body, speech, and mind. Well, the Buddhist view of what action means here, what karma means here, the significance of it is that when we engage in any action of body, speech, and mind, when that action is finished, right, it's not finished. We might think it's finished, but any action that we engage in, with of course, it needs a certain amount of awareness behind it. But if it's done, especially with a strong intention, what happens when that action is finished? Is that the end of the matter? Does it leave something behind?
It'll have a result.
That's down the line. Before the result. An imprint. This is an extremely, vitally important point of the Buddhist teachings in general, and these teachings in particular, that when we engage in an action, it's like, is there such a thing as a self-programming computer? Have they invented things like that? No?
Soon.
Okay. There's obviously something people are thinking about. So you have a computer, and then it is programming itself for some kind of...
Learning.
Yeah, okay. But even something, you know, kind of more, you know, the output is kind of more than the input in a sense, right? I'm the bad person to use computer analogies, but this idea of a self-programming computer somehow, to my mind, felt a very strong analogy to our own mind when it engages in actions. I'll give an example. I get really angry at somebody, and maybe I strike the person, or if I'm too much of a coward to strike, then maybe I think of a really cutting insult, you know. and then I say it, and it hurts that other person's feeling. Or if I do strike him, then it might hurt his jaw or something, wherever I hit him. Okay. So from a worldly point of view, that's the result of that action. Hitting hurt the person's body, insulting it hurt their feelings, whatever it was, right? But there's another hurt going on that's way beyond that, and that's what karma is talking about. What's that other hurt? Anybody? Who are we hurting when I get angry at this guy over there? Maybe hurt his feelings, right? Who is really being hurt by that action? Oneself. That's why I'm saying like a self-programming computer. Because, as Angela says, when we engage in actions like that with a sufficient amount of strength, right, it leaves an imprint on our own stream of consciousness. Right? And that imprint can be likened to a seed. Right? And that seed stays on the stream of consciousness either until it sprouts, like in an experience of suffering, and then it kind of exhausts it, or until it's purified, because there are ways of depriving a seed of its potential. Like in a real seed from botany, it has the potential to give rise to a flower, let's say, but you could burn that seed and destroy its potential. So similarly, you could do that to these karmic seeds on the consciousness, so it won't lead to its result. But if you don't do anything, then until it's actually led to its, until it yields its result, it retains that potential. I think I recall that I was told that Thupten Pandey is going to be teaching on the 600.
Three principles.
Yeah, so he's teaching in this Tsongkhapa series.
Yep.
And I remember many, many years ago when we were both overseas, he described a situation, I think it was a picture, I believe he saw it in the National Geographic, but I'm not sure, and it was a sand dune in the middle of a desert like the Sahara. And it had rained. It hadn't happened in anybody's living memory, generations. But it rained. And then the picture was all these wildflowers that growing out of these sand dunes. A sight that you could live for 100 years and not see. But the photographer happened to be there and saw them. So what that indicated was that all those years there were seeds that had retained their potential to produce a flower, but it didn't have any of the contributing factors. It didn't have the moisture, it didn't have a gardener to attend to them. It didn't have somebody with a shovel. It didn't have all these things that were necessary. So it just remained in this potential form as a seed. Right? Then when the conditions became appropriate, then it gave rise to the flower. And of course, once that happens, once the seed gives rise to the flower, that seed itself no longer has the power to produce more flowers. Okay? Yes?
Like, how do we know this seed exists?
Can we use a mic so it goes on the recording?
Oh, I guess.
How do we know that these seed exist?
Because you can buy them in a seed shop. Oh, you don't mean seeds of flowers.
Yeah, you mean seed.
You mean seeds of karma.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, they don't have any form, so you can't see them, right? But this is also one of the areas, they often say that in and among the Buddhist teachings, there are some that can be verified by just simply direct perception. There's some that are more hidden, that you have to use logic and reasoning and analysis to discover, like the teachings on emptiness, right? And then there's others that are very hidden. And And that's what they call it. The obvious, hidden, and very hidden. And among the very hidden ones are things like karma, right? Where the exact connection between cause and result is something that you have to have an extremely subtle mind to be able to see directly, right? So this is one area in which a certain amount of reliance on a person that we think is in fact reliable, and we can have reasons for thinking that Buddha is reliable in talking about the causes of suffering. We have to rely on that authority until we reach a state in which we can have the same kind of awareness, the same kind of consciousness. Now, as far as I can see, I think the existence of these seeds is something that we have to rely on someone who has a stronger vision to be able to verify. I might be wrong. There might be other ways of understanding it directly. But through implication, we can get a sense that it actually that it does make sense that there is a potential for let's say, for anger to arise. Because there are moments in which we're not angry. Mind is very peaceful. But then something happens out there, and suddenly the anger arises like from a volcano. So where did that come from? Was it the words that disagreeable person said that caused the arisal of this volcano in our heart? That was a condition for it, but it must have come from somewhere, right? And so this image of a seed, and the seed is maybe too physical an image to use. The other words, I've printed out a bunch of other words, a predisposition, propensity, like that, proclivity, right? Maybe those are better words because they're less concrete looking. That the mind has these things, a predisposition. And we do also know that our mind does have certain predispositions, that based on certain things, experiences we've had and that we've repeated, we have a predisposition to feel this way or to feel that way, even when we're not feeling that way at the moment. Okay? So that's the best answer I can give. But maybe there's a better answer. Okay, so the first one, the basis, is sometimes called the karmic imprint or the latent proclivity for an affliction, or predisposition or propensity, a seed of karmic instinct. And all of those other translations or other ways of phrasing it are all on the handout, so you don't have to worry. You can always look back on it. And all these terms are taken from the different suggested reading list, which is at the top of the page. It includes Tsongkhapa's Lamrim, it includes Yangtze Rinpoche's commentary, Practicing the Path, it includes Geshe Zopa's extensive commentary to the Lamrim Chenmo, The Steps on the Path to Enlightenment, and then Lama Yeshe's own Wisdom Energy. Right? So those terms, those alternate ways of explaining what these bases and all these other objects are, come from all those texts, and you can look and see their context for yourself. So there is the basis. One of the by the way, should we take a break, like to stand or stretch before we come back and continue?
Are we halfway finished?
We are at 11:30 now, and this is meant to go to around 12:30. So do you want like a 5-minute break to stand or stretch or get a drink and continue? No?
Do you?
No.
Okay.
No. But I know a lot of people have been sitting here for a long time, and I know how tiring it can be to listen to me.
Oh.
I have to listen to myself 23 hours a day. It's really tiring. So So we have the basis, this seed of karmic instinct, this predisposition, right? One of the logical conclusions from that, maybe we could say, is that if we don't have such a seed, such a predisposition in ourselves for a particular delusion, that delusion won't arise. In other words, if you have in front of you a bowl of sand, there's no seeds in it, just sand. You can wait forever. You can water it. You can put it out in the sunlight. You can add fertilizer, and nothing's going to grow. Why? Because there was no seed for it to grow from. So similarly, if we don't have the seed or the proclivity for a particular delusion, the delusion won't arise in the mind. And that is actually the hope, or we could even say the promise, that comes together with practice, that it is possible to remove all of the instincts, the proclivities, the predisposition for delusions from the mind. It's possible to remove them. And in that case, we experience the third noble truth, the cessation of suffering. It's like expecting flowers to grow where there's no seeds. Delusions won't grow if there's no predisposition for them. Okay, that's the good news, that it's removable. The bad news, to put it this way, it's very hard to remove. But it is possible, and in the Buddhist teachings is a description of how to do it. And the Buddha gives a whole list of things to do, and most of the items on that list is to subdue the delusions, to make them not as virulent as they were before, right? So, let's see, an example popping into my mind is there's this troublesome neighbor and always saying something insulting to you. And on that particular day, he says something insulting to you, and you still have the predisposition for anger, but you've learned a little bit. Oh, that's that Shmagegi. It's like he's just that way, And by the way, he has a hard life, so he's just taking it out on other people, and he's kind of miserable. So I feel kind of, compassionate for him. So all of those thoughts, they don't eliminate the seed of hatred within us, right? But it reduces the strength of any discomfort that we feel. But by itself doesn't remove them. So the only thing that actually removes them, right from the root, is what? There's only one thing. Well, enlightenment is a state, right? Purification helps, but purification up to a point basically just reduces the strength of a delusion. But to actually obliterate it, to actually burn up those karmic seeds,
you have to adopt a peacock.
you have to adopt a peacock. Right, okay.
You have to try to merge the what is it called?
Realize emptiness.
Yeah, that's the answer. Yeah. Not everyone may have heard. Joe said, you have to realize emptiness.
Yep.
Right?
So when Rinpoche is talking about emptiness, he always uses the word basis. Is this the same basis?
Say it again. No, so that it goes out.
When Rinpoche is talking about emptiness, he always talks about the base and the basis.
Oh, that's a different context of the word.
Oh, okay.
That's quite a different. That maybe later I'll mention that to you because it takes us in a different direction. But that's just a different use of the word, right? It's the basis of imputation. That's different. Yeah. Yes, Min?
Yeah, but so I guess can you explain on what you mean by realizing emptiness? Because so basically, you know, I can see chair is empty, your form is empty. Emptiness is not different form. I can say that, but that doesn't mean that I have empty my karmic seed.
Yeah. Well, first of all, saying that, even saying a very accurate, involved description of what emptiness involves, being able to quote Chandrakirti, is not the same as the realization of emptiness. You know, at best, it's some kind of intellectual approximation of it. But if you've ever received teachings on what's known as the 5 paths or the 10 bhumis, are those phrases familiar to any of you? There it describes how in the beginning you gain some kind of familiarity with the teachings on emptiness. Then you sharpen your intellectual understanding of it. Then you get a direct insight to it. And with that direct insight, a certain class of delusions are gone then, at that moment. But those are all only the intellectually acquired delusions. They're not the real deep delusions that we're talking about, right? And then what happens is from that moment on, the Bodhisattva moves through 10 progressive stages. And these stages, he or she is merging their mind, their extremely concentrated mind, on this wordless realization of the lack of inherent existence. And with that, and it's described in several texts in quite detail, different delusions are then progressively eliminated. First, the grosser levels are eliminated, then the subtle, then the very subtlest, until eventually, at the end, there's nothing left of the propensities. The basis has been completely removed, right? So it's not just a matter of, oh, I heard some teachings on emptiness and I have a pretty good intellectual understanding and I've meditated on it every once in a while. It's not that. It's a deep immersion into what absorption into emptiness actually does in this state of single-pointed concentration, right? But if you're interested in that, at least to get a sense of how it's outlined, then there's a lot of teachings. It's often called salam, what is that? Grounds and paths, the grounds and paths. And so what's discussed is the 5 paths and the 10 bhumis. And there that's described in more detail. It's not just turning the mind to it, right? The actual elimination of the seeds is only through this very, very deep single-pointed concentration on that experience in meditative equipoise. And it's a long journey. Tantra speeds up that journey, but it's a long journey to be able to get to that. But the proof that this is possible, if we can take this as proof, is that when we meet with people who have really trained their minds sufficiently, and we see them in situations which would have aroused, let's say, hatred in almost anybody else that we've ever met, right? And not even the whiff of hatred arises. I mean, we can't look into their mind, but we can see by their expression on their face and their whole demeanor that there's no hatred arising, right? This is an indication that they either have completely eliminated the root of that particular delusion, or they've weakened it to such an extent that it's not manifesting in any obvious way, right? And maybe in our experience with teachers that we've met, or people that we take as, exemplars. They don't necessarily have to be Buddhist, but someone who you think, oh, this person has really gone beyond jealousy, has gone beyond hatred, like that. Are there people like that you've met in your life, that you've seen, that you've heard about? For ordinary, let's say, worldly experience, that's like a fairy tale. You know, people say, oh, everybody has hatred. Everybody has greed. Everybody, you know, you hear that all the time. Some people just do a better job of hiding it than others. But I believe there really are people who have so weakened the karmic instinct for the delusions that if they're there at all, they're barely there. What do you think? Is that pie in the sky, or do you think that's real? And if you think it's real, based on what? I mean, a lot of people answer that question of the Dalai Lama, you know, or their own personal teacher, or
There's Reba Rinpoche.
Reber, you know, like that. I met this Indian gentleman. He had a very high government official position in Dharamsala. I forget what it was, but part of it, he was in contact with the Tibetans. That was part of his job, and he was particularly close with Ling Rinpoche, the senior tutor of the Dalai Lama. And I remember him saying, he said, "I've spent a lot of time with Ling Rinpoche's presence." And by the way, Ling Rinpoche, you could say his major practice was Yamantaka, the Lord who overcomes death, and that main thing is to conquer the power of anger and hatred, right? That's Yamantaka, Dorje Jigje. That was even sometimes Ling Rinpoche looked like Dorje Jigje, you know, and so this Indian official, I remember him saying, he said, "I've spent so many times in so many situations with Kebje Ling Rinpoche, and I've never, ever seen him get angry." He's like, and he said, he has completely gone beyond anger, like that. Now, do we take his word as being true? Well, it's an observation. And maybe in our experience, we've observed something similar, that some people just don't seem to have the natural distribution of delusion that so many others have, or as I've been kind of hedging the bet by saying maybe there's some, but they're so weakened that they're not producing a result. Okay. I'm going to tell this story because it's my favorite story, and I've probably told it several times already, and it'll give me a space to think of what I'm going to say next. Okay. It's probably my favorite story in all of the Buddha's life story, and it's a very, very simple. By this time in the Buddha's life, he was quite well known, he was quite famous, he had a following, kind of a name. People respected him, but he continued to travel around from village to village, and in this occasion, when he came into this village, a very, very rude young man came up and accosted him, and just started laying into him and saying, "Oh, look, people think you're the blessed one, right? You're just as stupid as everyone else. You just pulled the wool over everyone's eyes. You're just ridiculous. You fooled everybody, but you don't fool me. You're just stupid, you know." So when he was finished saying this, the Buddha, who didn't react to any of this, he said, "Tell me, if you buy a gift for someone and the person doesn't accept the gift, who does that gift belong to?" I mean, this is a real story. This actually happened in the life of Buddha. So you can imagine if you were that young man or standing, he says, "Hey, wait a minute, I just insulted you, and you asked me this theoretical questions about a gift?" But it made him think. Okay, I buy a gift, I buy a present, I give it to someone, he doesn't accept it. Well, then the gift, it belongs to me. And the Buddha says, it's exactly the same with your anger. If you get angry with me and I don't react, the anger only falls back on yourself. You're the only one who becomes unhappy. If you want to overcome your unhappiness, you have to learn how to give up your anger. And with those few words, just a couple of sentences, the Buddha described for that young man so clearly that he could see it without a shadow of a doubt that he had always been angry in his life and he had always been unhappy. And he saw the connection. And he was so overcome by this that he said, "Could you show me how to overcome my anger?" And the Buddha said, "Oh, I would be very happy to show anyone who's interested," like that. And eventually he became, a follower of the Buddha, like that. And one of the reasons I like that story so much is there's stories of miracle powers, like when you think of what happens when the Tibetans celebrate Losar, New Year's. That's actually commemoration of 15 days of miracles that Buddha exhibited at a place called Shravasti, a place you can visit nowadays. But some really extraordinary things the Buddha did, like taming a wild elephant and things like that. But there aren't that many miracle stories in the life of Buddha. Things are really like, wow, it blows my mind, And when I heard those stories that were the miracle stories, I tended not to really believe them. I thought, oh, that's just a pious invention. But this event, the way he answered that angry man, I could imagine it happening. But it is, in and of itself, it is miraculous, isn't it? How many people could listen to all of those insults and then come up with the perfect way to respond, not out of retaliation, but to help that person overcome the delusion that's causing that anger in the first place, like that. So to me, that's a miracle beyond miracles like levitation and walking through walls. That's really the sign of the ability, the skillful means of an enlightened being. And when we say enlightenment, one of the ways of talking about it is enlightenment is completely the purification of all the negativities of the mind, all the delusions and so forth, and their propensities, and the development of, in particular, 3 qualities: universal compassion, universal wisdom, and skillful means. The ability to know intuitively just what is to be done or said that will help that situation, like that. Okay. So that was my timeout. So that's the basis. Now, not all of these are going to require as much background as I've given to the first one, but I think it serves as a foundation for the rest. Okay. So having the karmic instinct or the seed for a particular delusion in the mind is like a seed in the ground, and which won't bear its fruit unless certain conditions come together and certain things help cause it to come to life, as it were. Okay, and that is the second item, object. The object. In some commentaries, they say related object. Related object. So what does that mean? Let's say you have a very strong seed of hatred. That's there. It's not arising at the moment, but the potential for it is there. And then you come across an object, and the first object I'll talk about is something that's really nice, really attractive, really pleasant. Well, that's an object, right? But it's not a related object, because those kind of pleasant, nice, sweet objects don't serve to arouse the karmic seed of hatred. Now, if you had a very strong karmic seed of lust, let's say, then something that was beautiful and sweet might really turn you on, might make you filled with this very intense sexual energy. It's very possible, right? But not hatred. Why? Because that object wasn't related to didn't have that relationship with the seed. But let's say with that seed in mind, you meet someone and you just don't like the way they speak, you don't like the way they look, you don't like the way they think, you don't like their politics, you don't like any of those things. Coming into contact with that kind of object, that's a related object to hatred. So even beforehand, you weren't angry, as soon as you hear a person start saying those things that you just hate to hear, the hatred arises like that. So these first two objects, the basis, which is the karmic seed or the propensity, and the related object, these work together. And what's good to know about this, I mean, one of the reasons why this is, I think, a very helpful topic, it's not just theoretical, it's really practical, all of this, is that even though it requires a deep immersion into the meditative equipoise on emptiness to get rid of the first one, the basis, right? There are things that we can do to prevent ourselves from encountering the related object. And without the object, the delusion won't arise, right? Just the same way you can deprive the seed that's in the sand, you can deprive it from the sunlight and the moisture and fertilizer, and it'll just stay dormant. In the same way, you can have a lot of heavy karmic seeds, but they won't give rise to the delusion if we're careful to keep our distance from a related object, you know. And a lot of what passes for teaching in ethics, ethical discipline, taking vows, becoming ordained as a layperson or as a monk or a nun, all these things, a lot of those teachings, a lot of the Vinaya teachings are how to avoid things that would cause the delusions to arise. You're not uprooting the delusion itself, but you're putting yourself in a position where the delusions won't arise because you are one way or another insulated from the object which would cause them to arise, right? So, and there's a million examples of that, aren't there? You know, like if you know, for example, that there's a political commentator on the radio that you just hate, right? Right? Well, you could either just keep turning him on every day, or her, and just get angry and ruin your day, or you can decide, I'm going to give myself a vacation from that SOB, because all it is doing is it's not giving me any information, it's not giving me anything I can use, it's just upsetting me, right? So the seed for being upset is still there, but you're giving yourself a time out, a break from the specific arousal of the delusion because you're just not exposing yourself to that. Now, of course, that requires a certain amount of balance in your approach. You can't just live in a bubble your whole life or be like the proverbial ostrich who hides his head in the sand, right? But you can be skillful and decide, I'm just not going to put myself in that kind of situation, meet those kind of people, hang out in that company, because all it does is cause my delusions to arise. Okay? So there is a lot that can be done in relationship to the object, because unless those two are together, that particular delusion won't arise. Another one might, but that one won't. Okay? So, now, the next two, number 3 and 4, distraction and explanation, you'll see that these two they're not synonyms, they're not the same, but you'll see that they are related, or a certain similarity, because both of them refer to things that come to us from the outside that can cause delusions to arise. And the first one, number 3, it's called distraction. But you get a better sense if I give some of the other synonyms for it. Social context, misleading companions. Misleading companions is probably, it might be narrower, but it really gives the sense of what all of this is about. If you hang out and spend time with people who all they're doing is gambling and drinking and shooting up drugs and all of those kinds of things. You can hold out for a while in the beginning, but if that becomes your entire atmosphere, it becomes very, very difficult not to go along with it, even though it wasn't natural to you in the beginning. I grew up in a household in which nobody swore at all, right? I think in my entire life, I never heard my mother say one swear word. No, there was one in Yiddish she sometimes used, right? But other than that, never heard her swear in English. And my father, sometimes when he got angry, he would say something. But other than that, we were taught you didn't swear. Then I went away to college. I went to an all-male school in which swear words were not only every other word, but they were actually fitted. Some swear words were fit into the middle of other words. I'm going to say one. You'll have to excuse me for it. But I remember someone saying, "You're impeding my constitutional rights." Went right into the middle of words like that. So I remember I came back from home Thanksgiving. That school was up in New England, and I live in New Jersey. And I came back, and oy vey, it was really embarrassing because most of the times I was able to catch it, because it was so not done in my household. But every once in a while, just out of that habit, it would come out, right? And that habit came not really from myself, because that was not the natural way in which I evolved up to that point, but just by the atmosphere. So they use the word distraction, meaning those kinds of things that get us involved in those kinds of activities or things that we do or things that we say or ways that we think that give rise to this kind of gross, destructive, deluded way of behaving. One thing that I think is kind of an example of this, though it doesn't appear in any Dharma text that I've read, but you find an interesting item on the internet somewhere or on YouTube, and you're interested because you follow it. It's something that you like, and the first bunch of comments that come to it are pretty reasonable. Oh, I like this too. This is wonderful. But as soon as an opinion gets evolved, someone is going to go and saying, "You moron! How could you think that?" And then pretty soon, all of the comments degenerate into mudslinging, right? I'm not the only one who's noticed that, right? And one of the things that I've become aware of is that now people are actually warning, don't read the comments section. That the article can be good. Read that, and maybe the first two comments. But don't explore too deeply into the comments because they so quickly become vituperation, don't they? Really, really upsetting. But what happens if you keep going to the website, if you keep reading these articles, if you don't take that warning and you keep reading the comments, then slowly we get accustomed to it. And slowly our comments start becoming filled with this what to call it? I mean, it's really
Malevolent.
malevolence, really, like that. So, to my mind, this is like one of the items of number 3. Generally, they say things like the influence of misleading friends, misleading companions, because they're the ones that you spend time with and you pick up their habits. But these days, we live in a cyber universe which is connected everywhere, right? So there's people we've never met, many people we never will meet, but they are actually our companions. They're our companions on the internet and elsewhere. And so we can pick up these ways of acting, these diluted ways of speaking and acting and thinking, even from someone we've never met. But I think this comes within this context of misleading companions or misleading friends. Okay, the next one is explanation, and what it really means, a broader way of saying this to get closest to what it means, is following false teachings. Following false teachings. In other words, listening to and coming under the influence of incorrect explanations. So one word would just be explanation, but you have to figure out that this is really meaning explanations which are mistaken. And this doesn't just mean someone saying something that's not true. This is much more specific than that. The kind of false teachings or misleading incorrect explanations that are major causes for delusions to arise, significant causes for delusions to arise, are those explanations which deny the reality of something vitally important. So, for example, there are a lot of people, teachers and others, among teachers and others who have some kind of influence, who spout the belief that there's no such things as karmic imprints. There's no such thing as the working of cause and effect on this mental level, right? You do an action, once the action is done, it's over with. So you don't have to follow, you don't have to set a guard on your karma, because once the action is over, it's over, right? So cause and effect doesn't operate. You don't have to be careful about what you say or do or think. And especially because, well, sooner or later you're going to die, and that'll bring everything to an end. Okay? Well, that's not an unusual philosophy, is it? It's not unusual at all. Whether it's said or not, whether it's actually given as a teaching or not, these are things that a vast number of people, I can't say whether it's a majority or not, but a vast number of people profess to believe, right? Well, this is a very serious mistake, and it's not a serious mistake because, oh, Buddha said there is cause and effect, and you're saying it's not, so you're disagreeing with the Buddha. Shame on you. It's not that. It's that if cause and effect is a reality, and you deny its reality, it means it has direct effect on how you live your life. You're not careful about what you say. You're not careful about what you do, because once that action is over, there's no consequences to it. So that's the kind of false teaching which gives rise to a delusion. Right? There's other things you could be mistaken about, but being mistaken about that is just setting oneself up for more and more suffering. Okay? Another one that can be mentioned, there's a few, I'm just going to mention one more, is there's a lot of people who like the Buddhist analysis of the First Noble Truths. Yeah, life is suffering, I can see my mind is crazy. I can understand how that's the cause of this suffering. But what to do, that's life, right? In other words, there's no third and fourth noble truth. There is no cessation to suffering. There's no path leading to the cessation of suffering. And there's a lot of people who feel that. Not just because it's the Buddha saying it and they're not Buddhist. You can look at this in terms of many different spiritual approaches. But basically, we're dealt this hand and that's what we have, and there's very little we can do about it. And a lot of people, a lot of very, very sensitive people, a lot of very sensitive artists, and by artists I mean painters, musicians, writers, all these things. when you read their life story, you realize, oh, they gained really intense insight into the First Noble Truths. And they have an artistic ability to express it to others. You know, some of them, they can express it in their paintings, right? Some can express it in their poetry. Some can express it in whatever other medium that, you know, that they follow. And you would think, wow, these people, they've opened my eyes, you know. Like before I met Buddhism, to me, art was my dharma, you know, because of the way these incredible geniuses were able to present reality just as it was, you know. And you can think of whichever area that you're particularly attracted to, whether it's the plays of Shakespeare or the paintings of Van Gogh or whatever it is, you know, there's a really direct presentation of deep truths about our life, right? But then you start reading the life story of a lot of these artists, not all of them, but a lot of them, and how many of them ended in suicide or drug addiction or alcoholism. A lot. Have you noticed that? A lot of them. And you might think, well, how could anybody who could write such an insightful poem as this, or paint such a communicative painting as that, how could a person like that be so filled with despair that they would take their own life or drown in alcohol or drug addiction like that? Well, to give a very simplistic answer, it's because while they have insight into the First Noble Truth, they have no insight into the second, you know, the second two Noble Truths, the third and the fourth, like that. I mean, that's a very kind of a Reader's Digest way of talking about it, but I think there's some truth in that. They can see what's wrong, but they can't see that there's another way of going about it. The most they can think that they can do with their mind is dampen it. Yes, I can get beyond suffering temporarily, but just not thinking so much, just drowning. And the drowning can be in alcohol or substance abuse. A lot of people drown in work. They become workaholics. You know, their life is miserable, but they fill themselves up with so much busyness that they don't have time to think about it until, you know, sometime late at night before falling asleep, and then they have nightmares, you know. So following false teachings, you know, has the aspect of denying ourselves the possibility of getting beyond delusion because we're taught or we believe somehow or other that there is no way of getting beyond the delusions. Yes, I mean, I think you had something.
Yeah, I think that sometimes I have this discussion with my friends about nature of the mind and conscience and things like that, and they say,
I'm sorry, I missed those words.
oh, I was just talking to my friends about the nature of the mind.
Nature of the mind.
Yes.
I missed that.
And
Those are the
sometimes
words I missed.
they quote Descartes and they say, well, I think, therefore I am, you know, because I can think, therefore I exist.
Mm-hmm.
So does this philosophy belong to that category of false teachings?
One would have to really tease out the implications of cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, because there's a way of looking at it which has some relationship to reality, and there's a way of looking at it, especially because of that word I, how that I is being conceived, which could be the cause of all of the suffering. So one would have to kind of, really open up what all of that means. I don't think cogito ergo sum necessarily denies the fact that there's a cessation of suffering, or denies cause and effect. There's nothing explicit in it, but one could interpret it in such a way that it could lead to that. But I don't think it necessarily does. Okay. All right. The fifth, and now we're getting towards the end of it. We still have a while. So the next one, the fifth one, is habit. And this is, in a sense, almost the easiest one to explain. We know that it requires repetition to build up a habit. But once we've built up a habit, it doesn't require much for it to continue. Right? And actually, the example that I gave earlier of swearing at school, I use that as an example of misleading companions, but it's also an example of habit. You know, in the beginning, I didn't swear, or, very, very little, But after a while, where the swears took place before, during, and after each word, the habit became very, very powerful. Right? And if it's a habit of mind to get angry, or to be lustful, or to be dissatisfied, or to be filled with jealousy, or any of these things, then it just becomes that much easier for that same delusion to arise in the future. You need less and less stimulation. Sometimes you need, number two, you need a real object, a really attractive object for attachment to arise, and a really loathsome object for hatred to arise, right? You need something really vivid. But after a while, when the habit is strong enough, what do you need? You need almost nothing. You go to the doctor's office and there's a glossy magazine and you open it up and you see something. Now, one magazine you might see an attractive automobile, let's say, and suddenly you have lust for the automobile. You're dissatisfied. You want to possess it. You've got to have it, right? And then you open up another magazine and you see someone who belongs to the political party that you despise, and you're filled with anger immediately. You haven't even heard anything. You've just seen the picture of somebody like that, right? So habit is very, very powerful, and you don't need Lama Tsongkhapa or anyone else to say it. Everyone says it. It's so hard to create a good habit, right? Very hard to create a bad habit, but very easy to keep either a good habit or a bad habit going once you've established it, and difficult to remove it like that. So there's not that much more that has to be said, except that I've noticed here one of the synonyms for all of this, habituation, well, that's basically the same word, or becoming accustomed to past afflictions. You've made friends with the afflictions, they're your bosom buddies, so they arise that so easily. And then it becomes almost humorous how easy it is for a full-blown delusion to come forth with a minimum of stimulation like that. And the field of art that I was most interested in had to do with literature. And, in a lot of forms of literature, the characters that appear are not so much characters as caricatures. So what's the difference between a character and a caricature? Well, a character is somebody or an invention that has different qualities, A caricature is those qualities have been winnowed down to just a bare minimum. So you know that this person is a miser, right? He's no longer a full-fledged human being. You're still a human being, but, we have all of these, 51 secondary mental attributes according to certain teachings, right? But if we've become a caricature, we've reduced it to a few major ones. So do you remember Jack Benny?
Yes.
Right? So his whole character was built on being a miser. In fact, in reality, he was an extraordinarily generous person. Everyone says it, But his character was miser. was miserly. So they could get jokes just by saying anything that had to do with money. The joke didn't have to be funny because they knew that he was going to react to it. You could expect that reaction. And you check, a lot of literature, a lot of art, a lot of comedy is based on this person is no longer a well-rounded human being. He or she has become a stock character, you know. And you can expect him, if something is attractive, you can expect him to be lustful. You know, if something is frightening, you can expect him to be a coward. Right? So that's habituation. Okay. So now the last one. So all I've written there is attention. The longer version of it is inappropriate attention. Inappropriate attention. And there's synonyms for that as well. Mistaken conceptualizations. Okay. Before I actually get to it, because this is a good segue into it, when you have a chance and you look on this piece of paper, at the inappropriate attention is on the bottom. But if you look to the top of that section where it says the 6 causes, there's a brief summary of these 6 causes. And it says, in brief, an affliction arises when A, it has not been eliminated from the root. In other words, there's still the impression on the mind. So that's there. And it arises when B, the object is nearby, you know, so the thing that's going to stimulate either the hatred or the lust or the jealousy is nearby. It doesn't mean physically nearby, but it's available to you. You can think about it. You can approach it, right? And then the third one, C, you perceive that object erroneously. You perceive that object erroneously. And that one, that third part, is what's described in 6, inappropriate attention. And in the Buddhist teachings, there are 4 categories of inappropriate attention. And I'm sure all of you here have heard bits and pieces of this many times, because this is a major focus of the teachings. Okay? So first I'll just read it out what it says here. 6, inappropriate attention or mistaken conceptualizations. This means mistakenly, and it's divided into 4, okay? Mistakenly considering things that are actually impermanent, painful, impure, and lacking a self to be permanent, pleasurable, pure, and possessed of a self. Or to say, you know, to just put that sentence together a little bit easier to see the connection, mistakenly considering things that are actually impermanent to be permanent. Things that are actually painful to be pleasurable. Things that are actually impure to be pure. And the deepest one, things that lack a self to be possessed of a self. Okay. Does this sound familiar? Yeah. The very first one, the example that, you know, everything that we can see, hear, smell, taste, or touch, with no exceptions, is impermanent, which just simply means it's changing from moment to moment. Okay? If we really had a continuous understanding of that, and not just intellectual understanding, but we actually trained ourselves to recognize that, would we get really filled with hateful anger when things go wrong? And would we be filled with, over-the-top, enthusiastic pleasure when things are going well? You know, would we find attractive things truly pleasant and unattractive things truly unpleasant, to the point that it would cause a delusion to arise in our mind? We could still say, oh yeah, I like this one, this looks nicer, I don't like that, that's uglier, that's okay. But to really then lust after one and be filled with hatred for the other, that requires buying into a false view of the way the thing exists in the first place. I think it was the last time I was here, but maybe not. There was someone who in the past used to teach at this center, but hasn't done it in a long time. But I remember once he told me, he said, you know, John, I always break my watch. You know, he had like a pocket watch or a wristwatch. He says, I'm always breaking it. So what I do now is I refer to the watch in the past tense. Instead of thinking, oh, this is a nice watch, I think, this was a nice watch. Because I know I'm going to break it soon, so I might as well get used to not having it. Right? So basically it's like a way of just impressing on the mind that this object that's so attractive or so useful is impermanent. And therefore we don't get so greedy about it, so attached to it, so upset when it doesn't work, like that. So, I don't think too much has to be said, does it, about viewing what's impermanent as permanent. That's such a common attribute that goes together with the arisal of a delusion. You know, maybe one example. I used a car before. You know, it's like the car that's advertised and the car that you buy and then park in front of your house are two completely different cars. You know, one is a glossy picture that doesn't change, and the other is a bundle of impermanent phenomena which is constantly changing and soon is going to not work anymore. They're so different as to be almost completely unrelated, right? And most people, you know, without really thinking it through, they think they're buying the car that's in the magazine. What they're actually buying is the car that they end up taking home. You know? Do you think that's a fair analysis? I think, in fact, I think in our economy, the economy is based largely on making sure that things have a planned obsolescence to them. In addition to the natural impermanence, you know, making sure that they're going to be out of style or not working so well after a while, so that you have to buy another one. Okay. The second one, things that are actually in the here it says painful, but maybe it's gentler to say things that are in the nature of pain are actually pleasurable. Well, in the Buddhist teachings, a lot of things that are normally thought of as being pleasurable are defined in the Buddhist teachings as actually being in the nature of suffering, as being painful. And that's one of the hardest things, even for a dedicated Dharma student, to really take on board, right? Because the life we do have pleasurable experiences in our life. And I don't know about you, but I don't like being told that my pleasures are actually in the nature of suffering. Whatever that pleasure is, whether it's eating a piece of chocolate or whatever, I'd say, oh no, that's really pleasure, that's really nice, you know. So bug off, Buddha. Don't tell me that that's in the nature of suffering. That's you ever see on Saturday Night Live Debbie Downer? Don't be Debbie Downer. You know there is pleasure in life. There's happiness. You know. Well, yes, Buddha doesn't deny that, but when you look at the examples of things that we identify as being pleasurable, one of their biggest faults is that they don't last. Is that they themselves are impermanent. And soon, or sooner or later, turn into their opposite. So the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth bite of chocolate might be pleasurable, but what about the sixth, seventh, and eighth bites? Are they still pleasurable? At what point do they become neutral, and at what point do they actually become revolting? You know? And if we look at experiences that we have, physical experiences, emotional experiences, and so forth, that's something that we can discover. is that the things that we're in the habit of identifying as being pleasurable are still within the scope, within the nature of pain and suffering. The third one, things that are in fact impure, viewing them as pure. Here, the example that's often used upsets a lot of people, because it's often the example is an attractive body, meaning if you're attracted to a man or attracted to a woman, for example, that you view that body, that's the object of attraction, as being something very pure. And of course, there's love songs and poems and written, expounding the extraordinary beauty of, in this case, I'm using the human form, either male or female as an example. There are other things we could use as examples, but that's not a bad one for our society, right? So you find all of these praises to physical beauty. Am I right? Or not? Yeah. I mean, maybe I've been caught too much in Shakespearean poetry, but there's a lot of it out there. And love songs and all of these things, I married an angel and all of that, it's repeated all the time. Right? And so again, it feels like, what are you telling me that the body of this person that I'm in love with, who I find so attractive, that body is impure? Oh, come on. Right? Does anybody like me feel a little bit kind of nauseated when you hear that? Like, oh, don't tell me that. Why am I going to believe that? Are you some kind of dyed-in-the-wool Puritan? Are you going to say that there's no pleasure in life? It sounds too extreme. And you can certainly say it in a way in which it sounds very extreme. Right? But one of the things that we discover is that the object itself doesn't possess purity. It can be viewed as being pure based on our attitude. But if we put that attitude aside and we just look at the object that's arousing that sense of attraction, right? Where is the purity to be found? Right? And of course, in the Buddhist teachings, there's many examples, and by the way, you find this in certain medieval Christian teachings as well, in which you take an object which arouses kind of a lustful attachment, and you begin mentally dissecting it. Peeling off the skin and seeing what's underneath, or looking at it much closer. And then you realize there's nothing there that's really attractive, But if you step back, look at it from a distance and bring a certain mental attitude, then you can project some kind of purity onto it. But if you look closer, there's no purity to be found. And in fact, especially when it comes to the body, you find certain things which everybody agrees is rather nauseating. I won't go into a list of that because we're going to be eating lunch soon. That's my gift for you.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. And then the last one. This last one, if there was to be a full description of it, would easily take many, many lectures, and by people who are capable of giving those lectures in more depth and more completion than I am. Because this one is mistakenly considering mistakenly considering things that are actually lacking a self to be possessed of a self. Okay, so to get a sense of what that means, we have to understand that the word self can relate to many, many different things. Like all of us do have a self. If I do a roll call and I say, is Lynn here? Where's Lynn? She raises her hand. Is Urs here? He raises his hand. So there's these different selves that can reply to questions like that, But we're not talking about that self, the conventional self, right? We're talking about the self which exists up in that cloud above our head, where all our cloud cuckoo land thoughts scramble together and create a mistaken reality, you know. The incorrect understanding of self as being something which exists separately, uniquely, inherently, independently, separate from everything else. As Kebje Lama Zopa Rinpoche often says, the self which appears to exist from its own side. All these phrases, you know, they're just words. They don't mean anything until we see how they all are actually relating to the same delusion. That instead of seeing how things exist independent on things around them, and without the things around them they'd have no existence at all, how things exist independent on the labels we apply to them, you know, without understanding that, we encapsulate all the items of our experience in a little black box and think that is it. That's the self. Or our own personal self, that's who I am. You know? So think of some mental traits that you identify as being you, as yourself. Well, of course, you have many, many mental and emotional traits. But a lot of us reduce that list to a very small number and think, that's the person I am. I'm the person who always gets angry. You know? I'm the person who has to be praised or else I'm dissatisfied. I'm the person who's going through life trying to find someone who will love me the way my mother loved me. Or someone who loved me the way my father never loved me. Right? So we create an image of ourselves, not knowingly, but through our life experience, which narrow all our sever our interconnections with everything else. All the things we've been brought up, all the thoughts we've had, all the experiences we've had, and we've created this mythical, unitary, unchanging me. Right at the end, as a synonym for possessed of a self, it says, that is, the self as it is held by the view of the transitory collection. The self, in other words, not any self, but the self that's misconceived. Misconceived how? According to this view of the transitory collection. And if this topic is something that really interests you, you know, to get an understanding of what's the difference between the self that exists and the false self that we assume to exist, a very good into this discussion, a very good place to explore are those teachings about the view of the transitory collection, which is one of the, where does that fall in? There's the innate and intellectually acquired delusions, and it's one of the intellectually acquired delusions, I believe. I'm not sure about that. I can't. I think I fell asleep during that lecture, so I'm not so clear how it divides up. But that phrase, the view of the transitory collection, is a very, very good into unpacking this part of the teachings, which is very fundamental, because what we really are talking about is cultivating the wisdom of emptiness, because the wisdom of emptiness counteracts the ignorance which is exemplified by the view of the transitory collection, right? So one of the ways of understanding emptiness is to see what is it opposing. What are things empty of? And they're empty of having the kind of self which is viewed incorrectly in this way. Okay? And so, in one of the few times in my career, I'm actually ending on time. So I can't let myself get away with that. I have to have at least one quotation. Right. Or maybe I don't. 44. This is from Lama Yeshe's How Delusions Arise, page 44. You have a boyfriend, for example, with whom you are obsessed. You find his every movement and gesture interesting, the way he walks, what he says, what he does. It all seems good to you. Even when he does something incredibly bad, for you, it becomes a source of pleasure. You are concentrating so much on his attractive qualities that his negative aspects are totally obscured. The mind works in such a way, however, that if one day he says something particularly unpleasant to you, your attitude begins to change. You think, he's not nice at all. Your mind concentrates on this thought. Not nice, not nice, not nice. Soon, everything about him appears repulsive. There is nothing about him anymore that is pleasing to you. You can see this happen, can't you? It is incredible how the deluded mind works. First, something appears completely positive, and then it changes to its opposite. But I say that it is totally impossible for any object, any sentient being, to be completely positive or completely negative, right? Sentient beings, beings with limited minds. It is possible to exist and be perfect, right? But then you have to overcome being an ordinary sentient being. Right? Everything has both positive and negative energy. It is only the obsessed mind that sees things in terms of black and white. There's a certain saying I heard in the West, you hear what you want to hear. This is a very accurate psychological statement, a very good Dharma point. It emphasizes the truth of what we have been discussing. I won't read anymore. So, in the beginning, we tried to generate a kind of a motivation so that what we discuss here isn't just going to be a few intellectual points or things to memorize, facts to learn, but something that can apply to our life so that we're less under the influence of karma and the delusions which give rise to suffering. Okay. So we've tried to focus on it to the limit of our capability, and therefore that very effort itself has created some positive energy. The positive energy itself can be dissipated or can be destroyed in a moment of anger. So to assure that whatever positive meritorious energy we've created actually does produce its desired result, we dedicate it. So we may think, just as the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas have dedicated and continue to dedicate the meritorious energy of their positive actions, fully understanding that nowhere in the sphere of action is there even one atom of concrete, independent self-existence, but all is merely labeled by the mind, arising dependently. With that understanding, then the dedication is may all sentient beings be released from their mental and physical sufferings in samsara. May teachers such as His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Khyabje Lama Zopa Rinpoche, Geshe Dagpa, and many from all different traditions who reveal paths leading to higher rebirth, liberation, and full enlightenment, may they be endowed with long and fruitful lives. May we ourselves come under the benevolent care of such compassionate Mahayana gurus in this and in all future states of existence. May the Buddhas who abide in every corner of the universe continue turning the peerless wheel of the Dharma, and may we ourselves follow the path leading to full enlightenment and achieve that enlightenment as swiftly as possible in order to repay the infinite kindness we've received from each and every sentient being. And then finally, if there's anything that was said here through lack of skill or diminished understanding that don't accord with the intention of my teachers, may they leave no imprint upon our mind. On the other hand, if through familiarity with the teaching, something that was said here that does convey at least a bit of the intention of these teachers, may they be like something carved into stone and become part of our understanding. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.